Welcome to Integrated. This is the podcast where we seek to bridge the gap between the intellect and the will so that we can grow as disciples of Christ, surrendering all that we are and all that we have to the truth. Hey guys, welcome to Integrated. My name is Angela Erickson, and I am so glad that you are here with me today. I'm really excited to finally put an interview out. I'm so sorry that it's taken a while, but home life comes first. I'm a wife and a mom, and this is something that has to go on the back burner sometimes, even though I really enjoy doing these interviews and bringing you, hopefully a different perspective to things that we're talking about today in the church. So thank you for those of you who have been waiting ever so patiently, for my patrons who have made sure that this continues to exist. And I think you're going to really like this interview. I sat down with Frank DeVito. He is an attorney for the Napa Legal Institute, and he also writes for the American Conservative, mostly about, right now he's been writing a lot about Satanism and whether or not that they have rights in our country, things like that, religious freedom, so to speak. So this interview, we talked about his conversion story, which is really, really interesting. And woven through that, we sort of talk about politics and economics and discernment. What is proper discernment for the layman, and how we need to raise our families and live out our Catholic faith and our vocation. So I think there's a lot to be gleaned from this interview with Frank, and I'm so grateful that he waited so long for me to get this out. Thank you so much, Frank. And also, if you could spare a moment and pray for Frank and his wife. They just had their fourth kid a couple days after we recorded the interview. So, a lot of us know what that's like, having another baby added to the mix, and we could always use prayers for that. So please, if you would, pray for them. Thanks to those of you who continue to support my work, especially Star of the Sea Gifts and Our Lady's Closet. If you want, you can go to either of their stores and use the code Integrated10 to get 10% off. And you're also welcome to check out my Patreon and support my work for as little as $5 a month. It just really helps make sure that this stuff continues to exist for everyone else. And I really appreciate it. And so does my husband. So thanks so much, you guys. And we'll see you soon. God bless. Thank you, Frank, for joining me on Integrated today. I'm really looking forward to this interview. It's been a long time since I've sat down with anyone. So this is going to be a big deal. Angela's coming back, and I'm bringing Frank DeVito with me. Thank you for joining me today.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm glad to be a part of that.
Well, and I have to say, before we get started, everyone needs to take a moment and pray for you and your wife, because by the time this is published, you probably have had your fourth child. So really excited about that. You guys have a young family with four young kids, like, my husband and I did. So anyway, I just want everyone to pray for you guys, because that's a big transition, but it's going to be awesome.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, much appreciated. So if I do run out the door to the left, you know why. We're at 39 and a half weeks, so
Yeah.
We're at the any day now point.
That's so exciting. And I will also add, for anyone watching, I am drinking a brew from Tridentine Brewing. I don't know if you're familiar with Tridentine Brewing, but
no, I'm not.
Oh, you should find him on all, like, Instagram and Twitter and stuff. Trevor Alcorn. He and his family, they have a home brewing. Yeah, okay. So this is their Empress Zeta Imperial Red Ale. It's really good. This one actually might be my favorite so far, and I tend to like more, amber type beers. So anyway, wanted to throw that out there because I'm celebrating with you, Trevor, tonight. Thank you for providing me with the brews. All of that being said, I would love for you to talk a little bit more about you, because we connected on LinkedIn kind of randomly, but we share a lot of similar interests, and I've realized you have a lot of great writing and things like that. So tell us all about you, and then we could talk about your Catholic journey as well.
Oh, man. Okay, so I'll start with the present. Yeah, I think we connected over, was it the essay I wrote about that Satanism is not a constitutional right or something like that?
Yeah.
So that one got a lot of attraction and both wanted and unwanted attention. But I live in Eastern Pennsylvania. Obviously Catholic. We go to the traditional Latin Mass. We have a Fraternity of St. Peter parish here. We have 4 kids. By the time this runs, all 4 will be on the outside. So I have a fairly dramatic conversion story that I think we'll probably circle back and get into. So after my conversion, I was in seminary for a couple of years. I was in formation with the Disc House Carmelite Friars for a couple of years. when I discerned out of that. And again, I think we'll talk about this too, the
All of
discernment
it.
of vocation thing. Yeah. So this is just the drive-by version. So got out, realized that I needed to find something that I was good at and could earn a living doing, met my wife in the process, went to law school. So I'm a lawyer by trade, and I'm kind of in the process of getting out of directly practicing law, which was always kind of the dream. And I like politics and policy, and I kind of like a little bit of everything. So I did a little bit of private practice. I spent the last 2 years working as a government lawyer here in Pennsylvania. And then just last month, I took a job at the Napa Legal Institute, which is a Catholic lay apostolate.
Very well respected too. So that's
Yeah.
incredible. Great.
Yeah, the Napa
Congratulations to you.
Institute and Napa Legal. Thank you. Yeah, they do amazing work, mostly working to educate and help nonprofits to basically stay in compliance and out of trouble with the government so you don't end up in the news. So, yeah.
Which we have more cause than ever to be worried about that. Thank you, FBI,
Yeah.
if you're listening. FBI,
Right.
if you're listening, we love you. And I know he just said he goes to the traditional Latin Mass, but you don't have to worry about it.
Very funny, quick aside. So I have a friend, family who goes to our parish, and he's an FBI agent. And
Shut
right
up.
when
That's
right when
so
the story
funny.
broke, like right before the story broke, his family said, "Oh, we got transferred. We're moving to West Virginia." And so we were making fun of him, like, "Oh, you were just reassigned. How the jig is up." But
Right.
that wasn't the case. He's a real trad.
That's so funny.
So anyway, so Napa Legal Institute is my day job. Wonderful people, wonderful mission. This is the right time for my disclaimer because it's a 501c3 nonprofit. So anything I might say today is not the opinion of my employer, just me. That being said, so we do a lot of religious liberty work, especially, like I said, protecting religious organizations. And then the whole world of politics, policy, law, philosophy, I'm fascinated by how to take these kind of intellectual worlds and make them practical and actually do things. So I found myself involved in a lot of things. I've done some local politics, although I don't prefer to be involved actively. I like moving in the background. I worked as a policy advisor on a congressional primary campaign here just over a year ago, and that's actually how I started writing. So I was working for a good, solid Christian pro-life candidate here. He right before the end of the primary campaign, he did a big pro-life event, and he asked me to introduce him and to introduce the constitutional points and make an argument for like a robust pro-life federal case, because a lot of conservatives, libertarians especially, as soon as Dobbs came out and overruled Roe versus Wade, it was like, go back, it's back to the states. This is not a congressional issue, it's not a federal issue.
Right.
Back to the states, because the federal politicians don't want to touch it.
Yeah, I totally can relate to that because I'm from Minnesota, and I've been an anti-abortion activist for over a decade, and I'm very involved here. And so I've been at our Capitol many times now, just this legislative session, because it's been a complete show of sorts.
Yeah. Right.
It's been horrible. So I feel you there.
Yeah, and so that I gave that introduction, and then I realized that, this would make a really interesting essay, because in the wake of Dobbs, you had Republican politicians running away fast as they could from this issue.
100%, yes. That's exactly what happened here. I'm sorry. It's like, it still grinds my gears, because that's exactly what happened here. And then we lost horribly this election cycle, and we've been paying for it every single week practically since this legislative session began.
Yeah.
So
I'll give you one more aside on the politics of this, because it drives me nuts. So during the primary, my friend faced a more moderate candidate, and they wanted to moderate her message on everything, and she ended up winning the primary narrowly and then losing the general. And the advocates of her campaign would come to me, and they're like, your candidate, he's dead on arrival. He's 100% pro-life, no exceptions, and he's never going to fly in this swing state, and he's going to get labeled as an extremist. But then guess what? The moderate wins. And the Democrats just run these campaigns telling us that she's an abortion extremist. It really doesn't matter whether you're moderate or if you're to the right of, AOC and Nancy Pelosi, you're going to get labeled a pro-life extremist
you're right
anyway.
Stalin, you're an extremist these days.
Right.
Yeah.
So anyway, I took that that introduction after the primary was over, I wrote an essay called something like the originalist case for a federal abortion ban, and the American Conservative published it. And then I realized that actually I really liked writing essays and tended to have insights that I thought the conservative movement needed to hear rather than just kind of regurgitating what's in the news cycle. So I guess I kind of accidentally became a writer from there. So I do write fairly regularly. I've been in a bunch of publications, but if anybody is interested, that's my kind of intellectual home. I have quite a bit at the American Conservative.
Well, and I love what you said about having a perspective to offer that you weren't seeing, because often, for example, in my case, I often feel as if, or anyway, what kept me from doing this work for a long time was almost feeling like, do I really have anything else to add that people aren't already saying? And so it's nice to hear somebody who says, yes, I have something to say, and I'm going to make sure somebody hears it. And it's one of the good guys, it's not somebody with some sort of trite or boring or moronic thing to say, which is most of the news cycle. So speaking of politics, tell me a little bit more about what got you interested in politics to begin with, because some people naturally gravitate towards it, but for others, there's kind of a moment where they realize this is really important and I want to be engaged here.
Yeah, so I would say it's a little bit upbringing, and the rest of it is just kind of a winding path. So my dad was involved in local politics. He was an Italian in Connecticut, and so they were kind of like blue dog Democrats, because everybody was a Democrat who was from immigrant parents in the New York area, right?
100%, yes.
Yeah. So I kind of grew up around political people, but it didn't really mean that much to me as a kid. You didn't really think that much about it. But then as an adult, after my conversion and after leaving religious formation, obviously, the stakes were high. I left the monastery in 2015, so the primary was just heating up that would eventually elect President Trump. And everything looks bad, right? On one hand, it's a mistake to make politics into your personal faith and religion, which a lot of people do, right?
Yes. Yep.
Because for one, you'll just live a miserable existence because it's just terrible.
It's terrible. It's so yucky. Everything about it is so yucky. Yeah.
So I do kind of qualify my interest in politics with you can't take yourself or the whole thing too seriously, right? At the end of the day, the most important things I do for both my soul and society are in my home, right? It's my wife and my kids and my neighbors and my parish and the people you actually know. So politics can easily be an escape. But at the same time, I actually, one of the poignant moments, or really striking moments, a couple of years ago, the pastor of our parish, who's, I'd say, a little bit jaded on politics.
It happens to most of us.
Yeah. So he came over to the house, and somehow political things came up and my involvement, and he was surprisingly enthusiastic. He's like, no, you have a knack for it. And if you don't do it, then you're leaving it to all the terrible people who are going to do it anyway. Yeah. So I guess that in the end is my interest in being involved in politics, whether you're talking about working behind the scenes and helping craft policy or being in the writing world or whatever you're doing. People are going to do it, right? There's a need for it. There's an audience for it. And I figure somebody who's a fairly well-formed Catholic who tries to not just regurgitate the news cycle, there's something to contribute, and it's worth doing.
Well, we need good Catholics in politics. Otherwise, you get Catholics like Joe Biden, who are hardly Catholic at all and are nothing more than Judases who turn on their own any chance they get. So speaking of that, then how do you incorporate your faith into the work that you're doing? You're obviously doing that now with Napa Legal Institute, but are you kind of known as the Catholic guy? And how do you bring those Catholic principles and encourage people in that direction when you're getting involved in political work? Because I find so often, even here, we're so focused on ecumenism and sort of trying to just get everybody on board because there is power in numbers, but also Catholic social teaching is the best social teaching, and it is the most formative and robust that there is. So more people need to get on board with it. So how do you get people on board with that?
Yeah, I think it depends where you're talking about in terms of politics. You asked, like, are you that Catholic guy? It depends because in like the DC circles, because the institute I work for is a Washington DC institute. So
Hmm.
in that whole conservative and religious world, like you'd be surprised, almost everybody's Catholic. Like within the staffers and agencies, think tanks, like most of, no, I shouldn't say most of, but a huge chunk of the like extremely conservative new right young generation
Oh,
is
that's really
traditional
interesting.
Catholic. Um, but then it's very different when you come out here to like my semi-rural county in Pennsylvania, where the Republican base is like very evangelical, and
Yeah, in that Bible Belt area,
yeah,
kind of on the cusp there. Hmm.
yeah.
That's
So
so interesting.
it's an interesting thing. Like, what do you do to bring like the Catholic social teaching and Catholicism in general into that world? A lot of it, I find, is living it. For one, it's just articulating political positions from a Catholic angle, right? Like, I might agree with a lot of the evangelicals on a lot of policy issues, but the way I'm going to talk about abortion or traditional marriage is going to be very different because we're engaging Catholic theology, which is not quite the way they think of it. A lot of the time, it's like
Yeah.
very simple biblical principles, which are not wrong, but it's a very different way of talking about these things.
Hmm.
And then the other way that we bring Catholicism in, I feel like, is just by living it. My wife and I would go to local county Republican Party meetings, and we would have a baby, or she would be pregnant, like whenever we would go. And I think that alone,
I
it's like,
feel
oh yeah,
that. I
you're those
feel
young Catholic people. Yeah.
that is the story of my life. Right there. I mean, usually even when I'm recording, I have a baby nursing 9 times out of 10. Yeah, that's hilarious. So, tell me then about your faith journey and how this became so much an integral part of your life, because it's very obvious that your faith life is at the fore of everything that you're doing. So were you always like that? And you said you had a conversion.
No.
So what were you raised before you became Catholic?
Yeah. So my dad's from Italian and Czech Catholic background, so he went to mass sometime kind of when I was a kid. My mom's
Hmm.
Jewish, and they were secular, like New York Jews. So it was that very of that age, right? The people who grew up in
Yeah.
the wake of the sexual revolution. It's this kind of terrible idea of just, oh, raise your kids with a little exposure to this and a little of that, and let them figure it out for themselves. For reasons I'll get into in a second, that's a really poor way to raise children because the world is not neutral, right? If you like
Correct.
so what we had as kids is like we'd go to mass sometimes and on like Christmas and Easter and didn't really know what was going on. And like once
Hmm.
or twice a year we'd go to like a random Jewish service on like high holidays and didn't know what was going on. And so
Oh, interesting.
that's not serious exposure to either tradition. It's just like a little bit of a tourist view of a couple of religious sects, and it makes no sense to you, right? So
Right.
as a kid, you just kind of go where you're brought, whatever. But then you become a teenager who goes to public schools in a big, rough city, and I didn't have to like I wasn't 14 and deciding, do I want to be a good Jew or a good Catholic? It's like you get swept up into the world, right?
Hmm.
Because you have no foundation.
For
So
sure. Yeah.
I think I had said this to you off air, but I always appreciated post conversion the Confessions of Saint Augustine, right?
Oh,
Because you have
so beautiful.
this, yeah. But he nails the way that a Catholic ought to talk about a conversion, right? Because you have just enough sense that he had this like past of debauchery, and he tells the story about like stealing the pears for fun and
Yes.
how terrible he was. But
Hmm.
you know that there are like there's sordid stuff there, but he doesn't tell
Yes.
you any of the details, and that's prudent because that's nobody's idle curiosity to know about a pre-conversion life of sin in any kind of detail, right? So I
Yeah,
always
and
really
two,
appreciated that he didn't tell
I
them.
think people can kind of also in the retelling almost relish or sort of wish to be back in that state. I mean, I've found myself sometimes doing that, just thinking like, wow, I didn't have nearly so much responsibility,
Yeah,
like I can't even believe I could do those things. And not because I want to do those things, but there's a part of me, there we sort of, because of concupiscence, we just have that inclination. So,
Right.
and that's for the guys over at Avoiding Babylon. They always make fun of me about concupiscence. Long story, but there it is. I got it in the interview. So you had this conversion, and what was that like for you?
Yeah. So every time I tell it, it doesn't quite make sense to me, which is kind of cool. So, as a teenager, I got progressively more into trouble and all of that. And then by the time I was 18, 19, around there, I was getting in less trouble, but still just kind of miserable, right? It's like in the worldly sense, it's like, oh, you got through your teenage years and like got it together. Like I was always school was naturally easy, so I was in community college and doing fine, and they're on a scholarship, and I was working at my aunt's law firm and had a girlfriend. It's like, oh, okay, everything's stabilized, but it wasn't, right? Because life is kind of miserable.
Yeah.
But it's a more low key miserable than when you're like a wild partying teenager. So in the midst of that, I remember very particularly one day driving through the city next to where I grew up, where my dad would take us to mass now and again. And I hadn't probably been in there in several years. But as I was driving by the church, I remember being, kind of down and having this, not an audible voice, but a very like strong impulse to pull over the car and go into the church. And which was really odd because I considered myself a very outspoken, atheist and had no interest in any of that. But I pulled over the car and I walked across the street and walked into this empty little church. And it's not a particularly beautiful church, but it has particularly beautiful stained glass in it. And so I do remember I sat down and the sun was setting and the sanctuary faces west. So you could see the setting sun is coming through this big, beautiful crucifixion window with the tabernacle below it. And again, it's fascinating to think of in retrospect, because at the time I remember getting this profound sense of, you're not peaceful. The peace you seek, you'll find here. And again, didn't hear a voice, but that was very deeply the impression that I got from sitting there. And it's very strange because it's obviously Christ's calling, and Christ in the Eucharist particularly is sitting right there. But I had no idea what that was. Like I couldn't have told you that was a tabernacle, that there was anything in it. I didn't know anything. So it was definitely a conversion that was prompted by gratuitous grace, right? A lot of people come into the church because there was a person or who was influential, or a book or something. And I guess God knew I was stubborn enough that he actually had to like beat me over the head initially and drag me into a church. So that was the beginning of it. And then I've always been very intellectually curious, and I've always been my wife will tell you this, very quick to dive deeply into something that interests me.
I can relate to that actually a lot.
Yeah.
But I love your story because it is a conversion of the heart before the intellect. And especially because I'm a very feeling person, but I don't trust feelings. So you have to persuade my intellect. And you have to make a really strong case for it. And I will test it by fire every other way before I assent to agreeing with you 9 times out of 10. So to hear that in your story, it wasn't your intellect that was persuaded first. It was purely God's grace entering into your heart and moving your will in such a way that you realized this is where I belong, essentially.
Yeah. And like I had said, it's a very strange feeling to receive that calling of the heart first, because you literally, the head knows nothing about it. So you don't actually know what you're being called to, right? I had no idea what I was doing in that place or what it was all about. But then I just started to read. I was very blessed. It was just an average church, so you never know what you're going to get in terms of RCIA director, pastor, priest, who's going to approach you. But the couple that ran the RCIA program there, they're really wonderful, saintly people. Their daughter's a Nashville Dominican sister. So they were,
God bless them.
Yeah. So when I went there, they're like, well, it's kind of an odd time of the year, but like, let's start talking, start reading this. So I read through the scriptures, I read through the catechism, I started reading church fathers, and it's like, oh my goodness, this all makes sense, right? Yeah. What I was just pulled into is based in faith, but incredibly reasonable. And so I was hooked and was all in.
what was the book that moved you? Would you say that you would attribute, so I don't know, the thing that brought you the most intellectually into the Catholic faith? Like, once your will had been moved and you started doing all the research, what was the book that you would recommend to everybody?
Oh, that's a really hard question. I mean, obviously, the New Testament is probably the center one because once you believe the first two of the three great questions of C.S. Lewis, right? Does God exist? Yes. Is
Yeah.
Christ God? Yes. Is the Catholic Church the holder of the truth, right, of Christ's Church? Once you get through those questions, it's like, okay, then the New Testament is actually this is the life of the God man, right? So
Right.
that's maybe like the cliche answer, but it's the right one, is that you should
Yeah.
read the New Testament and you should read it deeply. Um, but then besides that, Augustine's Confessions was huge. The mix of um, just the personal testimony, the personal story, and really deep Catholic thought was really profound. That's probably, besides the scriptures, was probably the most influential book in my early conversion.
Wow, that's amazing. So, what was the trajectory like for you after you actually became Catholic, not just someone who had that nominal exposure, but when you decided to become Catholic, and how did that impact your wife? Were you guys dating or married at the
No,
time? No. Oh, so this
no.
was beforehand. Was she
Oh
Catholic?
yeah, way before.
Was she Catholic?
So yes, so trajectory. Okay, so I walked into a church at 18. I was baptized and confirmed when I was 20. So from the age of 21 to 26, I was in seminary and then
Oh, that's
religious
right. That's
formation.
right. Yo, yeah. Okay, so then we got to talk about this because
Yeah, go for it.
we touched on this a little bit when we spoke beforehand, but the whole process of discernment. What was that process like for you when you were discerning? And I'm just amazed that you had this conversion and then really considered a vocation in religious life, because I think for so many of us, it doesn't even cross our minds, even if we have a conversion. It's just not even an option for so many of us. So how did you get there, and what was that
Yeah.
process like for you?
Yeah, so that probably is a key to like my personality and how I do everything, is that I dive intensely into things, right? And so
Mhm.
to me, it was at the time it was kind of an obvious decision, right? And that, all right, I've just gone from like this meaningless life to there's God who is being itself, right? Literally that from which everything comes. And he came here and walked the earth and gave us like this blueprint of how we're supposed to live and invites us to live with him. It's like that's everything, right? Like St. Thomas
Mhm.
said, everything else is straw, right?
Yes,
And he's
100%.
talking about his own writing of the Summa. All of
It's
that is
crazy.
straw, right? So I guess that's kind of the simple thought. It's like, all right, I'm looking at the lives of the saints, and it seems that to conform most perfectly to the life of Christ externally, right, is to take religious vows or to be a priest, rather than to get married. And this is my, young, newly converted mind. It's like, okay, well, I mean, I'm all in. This is all that life is about. So try that. Um,
Yep.
which maybe I can get into a little bit of like my after the fact Monday morning quarterback look at my own vocation, because that's kind
Do
of
it.
interesting too. But I will just say this, because I think that as young in the faith and young in years as I was, I think there was something fundamentally right about that approach,
Yeah, I
especially
agree.
when you compare it to like how a lot of people discern their vocation today. I think we talked about this off air, right?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I wish I would have properly discerned religious life. And not because I regret getting married or anything like that, but I wish that in my mind that had even been an option. It was not in my home. Like, there was never once we were encouraged to consider a vocation in religious life.
Mhm.
And I don't think that that's proper to a Catholic home. A Catholic home, you want your child to do whatever God has planned for them. And that's, I think that's not necessarily the fault of my parents or anything. They weren't maybe raised to think that way. I don't know. But for whatever their reasons, it was just never an option. I think as Catholics, we have a duty to ensure that our children are really open to God's will for their life, whatever that may be.
Yeah, I wonder if just the last couple of generations, or maybe it's human, right? That it's you just get confused because objectively, there are three basic states of life to which God calls people, right? The religious vows, the priesthood, or married life. So it's They're three. It's very simple. Those three options should be in front of your children as they
Right.
grow up, right? But I think in the lives of most like ordinary Catholics, it's not like three even vocations. Like, no, everybody gets married, and then occasionally somebody else like becomes a nun or a priest or whatever. But that's not
It's an
normal, right?
afterthought. It's only
Yeah,
for like ugly people who couldn't settle down. Like, which isn't true, obviously. I think they're like, I look at religious sisters and I think they are the most beautiful human beings I've ever seen. They are angelic.
yeah.
But you know, I think there are some people in the secular world who are like, yeah, that's for people who couldn't settle down with anyone. It's like, no. They made a choice, and they found their spouse. I think they're going to be okay.
Right. Yeah, and you know, that's definitely not what God wants, is a bunch of unsettled, ugly people to be the ones closest to him. That's not at all what the calling is, right?
No. So,
Yeah.
okay, so as you were saying then, so this was the path that you chose, and your Monday morning quarterback look at it how do you see it in hindsight and that discernment process?
Yeah, so two things. One, I remember reading a book. I don't remember the priest's name. It was a Dominican friar from maybe like the 1930s or 40s called Vocation and Unnecessary Mystery. And it's been almost 10 years since I've read that, so this is all paraphrased. But the basic gist of it is that modern people think way too into this and are like searching their hearts for like a feeling or waiting to hear God's voice. And like a good Dominican, he's like, that is not what a vocation is. A vocation is the state of life to which God calls you, right? It's either ordinarily it's priesthood, it's religious vows, or it's marriage. He basically says that the religious vows do conform you more closely to Christ, right, as does the priesthood. So basically, he's like, look at yourself, ask what could make me happy and could make me into a saint, and I could be fulfilled doing for a lifetime, right? If you have any inclination that it's religious life or priesthood, go try it. Like, go talk to a vocation director and actually go do it, because that's not going to hurt. It's always going to be a good thing to try. And if not, if you think that's, I'd be too tempted, I'm completely unfit for it, then you get married, right? That's a human impulse. And it really is that simple, right? It's like,
Yeah.
what are you inclined toward? Can you be holy doing it? Good. Go try to do it.
Yeah. Go try to be holy. Like that's basically what it is. Go try to be holy and see where you are able to be holy. It's sort of like in high school, they push figuring out what career path you're going to take in high school. You know, most high schoolers can't even figure out what gender they are these days. So, and they want them to select a career in high school or something to pursue in college. And then a college student changes their professed major at least 7 times. At least that's what it was when I was in college, however many years ago. It could be more now. But that's the thing, is there is so much time spent trying to change your major and trying to get the perfect thing. And then these kids end up in school for an eternity because they switched their major so many times. And I remember feeling kind of the same way of just, okay, I'm just going to go this way. I'm good at communications and it's broad enough that I can do pretty much anything I want with this. So I'm just going to do that and stick with it because I don't want to be stuck here in this liberal cesspool for 8 years, you know?
Yeah.
That was my discernment in college. But I love what you said about this booklet of just saying this overcomplicates things, because I do think a lot of young people experience this existential crisis when they're trying to discern their vocation from God, because it's a big deal. I mean, it is a big deal. It takes the course of your life in a different direction depending on what you choose. But God is he's not going to obscure in an inordinate way what his plan for your life is.
Right.
That would be cruel.
Yeah. He's not trying to trick you. There's not like this super secret vocation that you have to like listen really close in case you miss it and accidentally don't become a saint. Like, that's right. But I think that mindset, we're joking about it, but I think that mindset is really very much there. Like, anybody who's spent any time hanging around like a Catholic young adult group has met those people who, like, they've been in seminary in 3 different places, but they just didn't feel that it was the right calling, and they're waiting for God to show them the right one. And meanwhile, these poor people are getting into their 30s and 40s and have like not been able to commit to anything because of this kind of scrupulous fear that they're going to accidentally pick the wrong vocation.
Right.
And to your point, that's cruel. That's not how God functions.
No, and it's so funny that you say that, because I had a friend in college that He really struggled. He became Catholic during college. He actually wrote me the sweetest letter I've ever received, I think. After he became Catholic, his priest told him at a retreat to write a letter to everyone who had an impact on his conversion and helped bring him into the church. And it was the best letter I've ever read. Words of affirmation is my love language, so it made it all better. But he spent so much time trying to figure out what career path to take after he became Catholic that he was in school for a very, very long time and then ended up just continuing on in the National Guard. It's like you spent all this time agonizing while you were already in the National Guard, and now you're in a career in the National Guard. Congratulations. But you spent all that time worrying too. And I think Saint Padre Pio reminds us to pray, have hope, and don't worry. But you can't gain a single minute of your life worrying. And that's where that process of trust. So for you too, becoming Catholic, so much of that is surrender and trust. And then you go through this discernment process. When did you realize that you had to surrender that and pursue marriage? And what was that like? How did you meet your wife?
Yeah. So I spent the first 2 years in formation. I was in the college seminary. So I got my degree in philosophy for my diocese. And then when I got the degree, I went into formation in a Discalced Carmelite monastery. So I was in a semi-contemplative order for 2.5 years. And my wife is always happy about that because she's cradle Catholic from a family of 7. They were homeschooled and tratty. And so like polar opposite backgrounds. Yeah. So my wife comes from polar opposite background than I do. And she always says that like, because I had such a like drastic conversion and was not brought up in the faith, she's so happy that I went through a contemplative monastery for a year. She's like, oh, good. You got like,
that's a good point.
Got a lot of the purification and the spiritual life stuff going before we met. So I didn't have to deal with like pre-conversion, Frank, which I'm glad for her as well. So toward the tail end of my time in the monastery, I really, this is one where I kind of have to analyze it after the fact, because at the time I wasn't really sure what all was going on. It was just like all of a sudden became very unsettled and was like, wow, I was like so sure that this is where I was supposed to be for years. And all of a sudden I'm fairly certain that I'm not. And, prayed and spoke to spiritual directors and spent, several months between when that thought first formed and when my temporary vows expired and I left the community. Which was a blessing to have the time to slow down and kind of work my way through it. But I think in retrospect, what I came to realize is, and this is not a universal, right? God can do anything with anyone, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
But he ordinarily works within the confines of our fallen human nature, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm not a canon lawyer, but I think if you look back at the old canons before the 1983 code, whatever, the one from 1917, it was pretty normal that they did not ordain people to the priesthood or take people into religious vows who were not raised in like legitimate marriages, like in Catholic marriages.
Interesting.
And you had to, like, it wasn't absolute. There were dispensations. And again, I'm not a canon lawyer, so I don't know the contours of that. But it points to an interesting truth that I've only like realized after the fact. So I come from, a divorced household and kind of a chaotic upbringing. And celibacy, right, is not natural. It's supernatural. And so I think to be able to healthily understand and embrace celibacy, I think you have to have a fairly good grasp of what marital love and family life is so that you can healthily sacrifice it for Christ. And I definitely did not have that. And so I think as I was going through formation and did, youth ministry and young adult stuff and got to meet some like really good families, it was really striking to me to see what I had never experienced. And I think that's probably true of a lot of people. One little anecdote. So when I was in the seminary as an undergrad, there were 1, 2, 3, 4, I think 5 of us guys who lived there who were, Orthodox, very serious, and prayed and studied and really like took this seriously, and all really good guys. And looking back a few years after that time in the seminary, only one of that group was ordained a priest. And I remember thinking, that's so interesting, because they were all such solid guys. And it's like, oh, I come from, right, my background. And then my other buddy who had left had like, one was like abandoned by his father as like an infant. One had been the product of a terrible divorce when he was like 3 or 4. And it was the same story. One of them was like the house was chaos. And then the one guy who actually was ordained, it's like, yeah, he had a mom and dad who modeled Christ's love. Like they weren't, super pious, but they were good Catholic people who stayed together and raised like a healthy Catholic family. And he's the one who persevered. So, I mean, it's anecdote. But I think
That's really interesting.
yeah. So for me, I think that's what God was doing. It's like, listen, there are things that need to be healed. Oh, and by the way, you're not as holy or as patient as you thought you were. Here are some toddlers, and this is how I'm going to make you a saint.
You learn so much about your deficits when you become a parent. And I mean, I'm sure as a priest too, and in religious life as well. I mean, God, those wounds are going to be opened up in different ways, but I think it's really a gift to be able to break those cycles in your own family and kind of start fresh. I think a lot about, I was just looking at Father Ripperger's deliverance prayers for the laity earlier when I was tidying up my office. And, so much of that is breaking generational curses. And we get to do that for not just our children, but our children's children and so on. That's part of the legacy that we leave is creating a spiritually strong family that can pass the faith along and bring more souls to Christ than maybe otherwise would have. So what a gift. That's amazing. So after you left seminary, then what happened?
Yeah. So I went back to Connecticut where I grew up. Got a job, tried to kind of reorient and say, okay, I'm back in the world. What am I doing? And again, I think armed with that kind of realistic understanding of discernment, did the same thing with career. It's like, okay, I want to get married. I need a career that's going to support a family. I'm not going to be in school for a million years or have to like cross the world to find a job or whatever. So I looked at a couple things and was like, okay, I'm fairly good academically. I have a good like political legal mind. I'll go to law school. And again, I think that's a really important thing. I've talked to a lot of priests about that after I left, that a lot of priests or a lot of people who leave seminary or leave religious life have almost this like clericalist guilt that like, okay, well, I'm not going to be a priest. So probably subconsciously, I want to do something that like looks like ministry, right? So they become like Catholic school teachers or youth ministers, and not that there's anything wrong with those, but again, your vocation primarily is not your job. Your vocation is your state in life, right? So for a married person, that's to love and raise a family. And for the man, generally, that means like getting a job that actually financially supports the family. So there's nothing wrong with teaching. There's nothing wrong with youth ministry. Somebody has to do those things. But for those of us who, okay, we're going to get married, we're going to be open to life, we're going to have a bunch of kids. Like it's really important that we find something that actually supports that vocation, which unfortunately, right, most of the things that I mentioned in Catholic world really don't.
Well, it's interesting because what you're describing is actually so often inverted because of the sexual revolution and feminism, especially for women, because they treat their career as their vocation and their motherhood secondary. When you said that, that was my first thought, was how inverted it is, because I struggle with that, and I have struggled with that in the past because we're so inoculated to it through the education system and so on. So as you pursued a job, when you met your wife, you guys got married, you've had a bunch of kids, happy story. Like, is that it? Or were there other points sort of your conversion that sort of, that percolate to the top of your mind that you think maybe other people can relate to?
Yeah. I think for me, there's the state in life, right? The vocation, it is the big question, right? It's like God calls us to be holy in every little way, right? Like Saint Therese, right? It's all the little things with great love that make you a saint. So for me, it's like, okay, so the vocation thing is no longer on the table. Like we're married, we're having children, I'm going through law school, now I'm a lawyer. That's the fundamental thing, right? Where it's tempting to be like, what's the next thing? Like the next big thing God's going to call me to do, this and that. But it's really just to live out the life as a husband, as a father, as a lawyer, as a member of my parish, as a neighbor, as a saint, right? Like I don't mean to make that sound too quaint, but that's it. I mean, there have been, moments of grace and amazing things that have happened in little bits over the years, but at the end of the day, that's it. I mean, you find your vocation, and now you have to pray and be holy like every moment between now and when you die.
No small task.
Right, exactly.
So in all of this, there are a few things that are sort of coming to my mind, I guess, because I've read some of your writing, and like I said at the beginning, it's very clear that your Catholic faith sort of permeates everything that you do and think about. So, and discernment too. That's really important. I mean, I just think you could spend your whole life just discerning into infinity every single decision you make, who you marry, how many kids you want to have, as if that's necessarily a choice. You could
Very freeing
what
to just not discern that.
what exactly it is. you know and then career and everything else, where you want to live. I mean, it's just a never ending thing, and so you just have to learn how to make peace with what you have been given and what makes sense. I mean, that's where the intellect comes in and says, okay, so this makes sense. And yes, supernatural grace can come in and say, even though this doesn't make sense, I actually know because of this grace that this is what we're supposed to do right now. We're supposed to trust, etc. But discernment in general is really hard for people today because so many of us are poorly formed. Our consciences are poorly formed, which is probably another gift of you going into religious life, attempting to, because you had so much formation in that most Catholics haven't had, even if they are a cradle Catholic. So what do you think about discernment within politics as well? Because as you mentioned libertarianism earlier, I find a lot of conservatives, even Catholic conservatives, they find that appealing. They find libertarian views appealing, things like that. I think many of us at some point have considered ourselves somewhat libertarian. Can you explain why libertarianism is terrible and the whole Satanism thing? Because on a cultural, political level, I think Catholics, we should be fighting more at the fore and using Catholic teaching and Catholic understanding of social issues, economics, everything to sort of bring about a revival in our country. We are just collapsing. So what are your thoughts about discernment in politics as well? Because it's important in our faith life, but also politically, and you're in politics. That's your world.
Yeah. Oh, so there's a lot there. Let's see what I can
I
unpack.
know.
Um,
I have a
so
really bad habit of doing this.
no,
Sorry.
no. I'm a lawyer. I can hold on to the couple of points that I want to get at one at a time here.
Perfect.
So the general question of how do we bring discernment and the Catholic life into politics? I think first of all, it's one thing to assent to truth, right? To be knowledgeable, because a lot of us who do things like listen to Catholic podcasts and stuff are like, we know our apologetics and we read and we have answers for Protestants and atheists
Yeah.
and all of that is really great. But the one thing, and I think this is from my Carmelite formation, is that you have to be serious about having an interior life, right? So beyond, I mean, obviously devotions are good, litanies, try to pray the rosary every day. That's kind of a staple, but taking time for silent prayer, for mental prayer is like I think the transformative thing for my life in the public world, particularly because it's so easy to just get swept up, right? I could wake up in the morning and like start reading things, start writing things, and go do work and
Yeah.
have meetings and talk to people and then go to bed. And it can just be this endless stream of things. It's really important, I think, to just take time to be quiet with God. And obviously we're lay people. We have, families and jobs and it's busy, but you're not too busy to pray. Right. I remember there's a very saintly Carmelite priest who I'm still very close to. And he would preach. I was living in Wisconsin most of the time that I was in Carmelite formation. And so he would preach to that very football loving
Yeah.
group of Catholics where like, oh, well, Father, I don't have time to pray like you pray. It's like, you have time to watch football because you love football. If you love the Lord, you'd make time because we have time for the things that we love. Right. And that was a kind of a shot to the heart.
Yep.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
So that's the thing. I'm very busy, right? You have family, you have political things, I have writing to do, I have work, but you're not too busy to pray. Nobody's too busy to pray. And if you think you are, then you have to reevaluate. You should actually take a piece of paper and write down what you do every 15 minutes from when you wake up to go to bed. And if you're watching TV or if you're on social media, you're not too busy to pray.
Yes, 100%. I so agree with you. And yet what you're saying comports really well with one of my interviews that I did before I, was struck ill for a month and a half. But I interviewed Dan Burke. I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but he's over at the Avila Institute and is brilliant when it comes to teaching people meditative prayer and things like that. And he said the same thing, meditative prayer. Many of the saints argue you're not going to heaven if you aren't practicing meditative prayer, because how can you really encounter God if you're not conversing with him? You just can't. And because heaven is a state in which you are constantly in the presence of God, and if you haven't practiced that in this life, how can you expect to be in that? Your soul won't be ready for it for eternal life. You haven't primed it.
Right.
So
yeah, absolutely.
And for both of us, like, you got to stay on that meditative prayer. You got to get on that mental prayer. Head over to the Avila Institute if you're wanting more information or help, or find Dan Burke's books. I definitely highly recommend it. You will also realize the state of your soul is not nearly as good as you think it is. I speak from experience.
Yeah, that was, I think it's St. Teresa of Avila, or maybe it's John of the Cross. I spent years in formation. I always forget where I read what, but talks about, if you're in a room and it's fairly dark, you're like, oh, it's pretty clean. And then you open the window and then you turn a light on. You're like, oh, it's pretty filthy. There's dust in the air. There's dirt on the floor. Right. And so that's kind of what mental prayer does. Like, if you think you're doing okay, but if in the light of God, it's not to depress you, but it's to make you see yourself a little bit more realistically as you are.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you. So how does that comport then with politics? So that's how you do it every day, the practical integrated component of just living a Catholic life, and especially in a world that is so antithetical to Catholicism. But then in politics, how do we be discerning and use what God has graced us with to make informed decisions on our politics as well?
Right. So I think this is the really hard prudential judgment that you have to figure out, is when we can form coalitions and make compromises and when we can't, right? And that's both true on a policy level and on a personal level, right? It's like, you can go and do the cocktail parties and the political stuff, right? But you can't have affairs. You can't lie, right? There are things that we just do not do as Catholics. And that's why the prayer is so important, right? To keep yourself actually strengthened to follow through on those. Obviously, like, the affairs is a more extreme example, but like lying, right? Like, people and I'm not just talking about like big politicians on TV. I mean, everybody lies. And like, when you say things like in a job interview or in conversation, like, yeah, I don't lie, people don't really believe you. Yeah. But if you actually don't, and that's one of the big things that I think has always, I hope, distinguished me as a lawyer as well as in politics, is like, I won't lie. Like, there are careful times to not reveal the whole truth, but that's different than lying, right? So that's true on a personal level, right? There are just things you can't do, and you always have to remember that you can't go along with the tide. And if you're in the political world at all, there's a big tide, right? So you have to acknowledge that to a certain point, you're just going to live and act differently than most of the people in this world. But then more to the policy point, right? It's really important to distinguish between things that we must hold as Catholics in the political realm and things that are prudential judgments. Because I think we get in trouble on both sides, right? You get on the first issue, you get the like liberal Democrats who are Catholics and like, oh, well, my faith tells me that we need to be compassionate and allow, abortion, euthanasia, you pick the issue, right? Those are closed issues, right? As Catholics, you cannot hold those positions. You cannot be pro-abortion, right? You cannot be pro-euthanasia. You cannot be pro-same-sex marriage. You can't be pro-gender ideology, transitioning genders and all this stuff. Those are non-negotiables, right? So that's a problem with people, I think, more so on the left who are Catholics. But then you have a kind of purist issue on the right, and then we can get into libertarians. I think that pivots nicely into that, where you get people who are so adamant on points of politics that we are allowed to disagree with as Catholics. And if you know Catholic social teaching, you'll understand that. But they get so deep into these things that they treat it like it's a matter of doctrine. Like, well, if you're not, like, I have Christian friends who will talk about this, like, well, but you're a conservative. Like, how can you be pro-tariff, like free trade and free markets and low taxes? I'm like, dude, those aren't, It's not like the anti-abortion issue. Like these are judgment calls, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can apply social teaching of what's fundamentally just and what's for the common good, and come out on all different sides of how high should tax rates be, should we have tariffs or absolutely free trade. So I think that's just an important thing to keep in mind as we engage in politics, is you have to know enough of your faith to know what's off the table, not compromisable, and then be a little bit more chill about everything else. Not because these issues aren't important, but because you end up seeing like Catholics attack each other as if one of them is a heretic over like tax
well, and they
or
probably
trade
will
policy.
call them a heretic. I mean, it's crazy. I mean, I just feel like not right now, that's sort of like the Catholic term for racism. It's like, I don't like you and I don't like what you're saying, so I'm going to call you a heretic. And even if what they're saying is not heretical at all, or if they genuinely just don't understand the doctrine they're talking about, so they haven't made an informed case on something, they're just saying it, and they're not trying to be a heretic. Like, you have to knowingly be a heretic to be a heretic.
Yeah. No, I know. It's funny. I have a friend who works down in DC politics, and he'd said to me at one point, he's like, do you identify as, I don't remember what it was, neo-integralist or Thomist leaning, traditional Burkean, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, and I said, no, I don't play those games really. Like I dabble in a lot of this stuff. He's like, good, because these kind of labels are basically the gender pronouns of the right. Like this is how we identify ourselves into oblivion.
It's so funny. It kind of is like that. And I'm so sick of all of the labels, because so many of them feel useless at this point. We're just labeling everything into these minuscule proportions. And I sort of realize, for a lot of us, we have a tendency to make these labels our identity instead of our identity being rooted in children of God, being created in his image and likeness, and leaving it at that. I mean, it's like we have to label ourselves by how we think or how we're attracted, or, all of these different things, which are secondary. They're not the primary source of who we are. So, I don't want to interrupt anymore on that, but moving it more into the political realm. So yeah, there's a lot of areas that we should just, I agree with you, relax on, especially when it comes to economic policy. But what else are your thoughts on that?
So I want to touch the libertarian question, because you brought it up once or twice, and then you just mentioned economics, so now I'm here. And again, if you identify as a libertarian, you're not a bad person. Like
no, I
don't
don't think so. No, this isn't to harp on libertarianism necessarily, or people who hold this view. Like I said, I think many of us have at some point, but as you pointed out in that article on Satanism, it's just an abject failure in thought when you take it to its conclusion.
Right. So I have two issues with it. One is kind of the theoretical one, and one is a practical one. I'll try to get through them quick. But on the theoretical level, if you push libertarians, maybe not that hard for this to come up, the understanding behind it is that government itself is bad or unnatural, right? And frankly, I think that's wrong. You might be able to say our government administration is bad, or most governments tend to be filled with corrupt people who make all kinds of terrible choices. That's right. So that's why I think conservatives tend to be friendly toward libertarians most of the time, because, but ours is practical. It's not government is bad. It's this government is overreaching, or this government is disordered. And so the more we can get them out of our lives and shrink them, the better. But I think to be an ideological libertarian, I just don't understand it, because I reject the idea that we ought to exist in a state of like governmentless nature, right? Maybe
it just lends itself to complete moral relativism. Then that's the problem. I mean, we can see that on a philosophical level on other issues like abortion or some of these other things that we've talked about. But it's almost like there's something that's been severed from seeing that within libertarianism. It is basically moral relativism as a political ideology.
Yeah. And then tied to this, to your point too, right, is the practical, like, where does this lead, right? And I think I'd be more sympathetic to libertarianism making sense if we had stronger private and local institutions, right? Because you can make the argument that if you have strong, stable families and strong, stable churches and small schools that are doing great and your neighborhoods are good, then good, yeah, shrink the government, and basically it's an evil, we don't need it, because the private institutions can take care of the people better than the government. Fair enough. Where do we live in now? If you get rid of government, what do you have? I mean, you have, your life's going to be run by what? Mark Zuckerberg and Google and Amazon, and then like a woke private woke corporations and private woke universities. I mean, the private sector is not good. And that's the big problem with libertarianism today, is if you get the government out, you are leaving people captive to forces that are now,
well, they're still captive to money.
Dangerous.
They're captive. Yeah. It still comes down to money too. I mean, yeah. and that's where I think we need to reclaim a common understanding of subsidiarity in Catholic social teaching, because it should be inverted from how it is now. The federal government should not be bigger than the state government in terms of policy making and, how citizens live their lives. Their locales should be making more of those determinations than they are today. And so, yeah, I would agree with you that I think libertarianism could make more sense if we reclaimed that notion of subsidiarity, but that's not our current political system at this moment. And you're right. At the end of the day, people are just going to be taken advantage of by private interests and money. That's just where we are in a technocracy right now. Do you have any parting thoughts? And if you could also just let people know where they can find out more about you and your work, I would love to send people your way so they can read your writing.
Sure. Yeah. So I think we've done pretty well, but I would say if you have any impulses to get involved in things, it's not that big. Like I said, my whole foray into politics and policy has kind of been a big like stumbling accident, or God leading me without me really realizing it, whatever. But if you just get involved, like it's actually as simple as going to like a local county political meeting, or go to your town council, or go to your zoning board and see, right, is the farm down the road going to get turned into a warehouse? Go be there and say something, right? That we have this false idea that getting involved in politics means like yelling at Fox News and tweeting about things. It's, to your point about subsidiarity, it's local. And you can actually do something on the local level, because things are actually happening at your city council or at your school board, as people are starting to wake up to, right?
Yeah.
So get involved, but get involved in something real with people who you live near and where you can actually make a difference. And it will be a blessing, right? If you take a life of Catholic faithfulness and prayer and walk into these kind of places, that's what God wants us to do, right? Saint Jose Maria Escriva, the founder of Opus Dei, had said, something like, God needs a few of his own in every field. So I always love thinking about that ideally we don't need every Catholic to go hunker down and be like a youth minister or a Catholic school teacher, right? We need Catholic lawyers and politicians and business leaders and accountants and everything, right? So yeah, anywhere we can take our Catholic faith into the world is a blessing. Including politics, as much as filthy of an enterprise as it sometimes seems.
It needs some cleaning up with some good holy water.
Yeah, right. So you asked where people can find me. So just to remind you, so if people want to look up more, especially if you're involved with a religious organization, a religious nonprofit, religious school, anything where you are some kind of a religious organization and you actually have things like bylaws and taxes and laws that you're supposed to comply with. Yeah. So I work for the Napa Legal Institute, like I said, and what we basically do is that sometimes at no cost, sometimes at a very nominal cost, we have extraordinary resources for religious nonprofits. It's not the hot button stuff, right? It's not like the Alliance Defending Freedom going to the Supreme Court and all that. This is the front end. Like, we give religious organizations the resources to stay under the radar so you don't end up at the Supreme Court with the Alliance Defending Freedom, right? Yeah. So if anybody's interested in what we're doing there, we're growing. We have some really cool projects that'll come out in the next couple of months. But that's the Napa Legal Institute. And then if you're interested in what I do, I write at the American Conservative fairly regularly. I write at some other publications. I don't use social media other than LinkedIn. So if anybody's interested, you can find me on LinkedIn. That's where I generally post anything I'm writing. And I'll give you links.
Perfect. I would really appreciate that. And thank you so much for taking the time this evening, especially as your wife prepares to give birth to your fourth child. Amazing. Thank you for coming on, Frank.
Oh, thank you so much. This was a lot of fun.